Stanley pen. So please do it before the end of class. Once I leave the room, you get 0 for your assignment. If you give it to me at the end of class, you get only 1 point up. Okay? So, now I'd like to revisit where I was last time. So I'm trying to turn off the lights from up here. It doesn't seem to be working. I apologize. I guess the lights aren't doing well. Okay, well, I'm afraid that that's a little bit. Okay, so the lecture today will again be slightly boring because the authors cover a number of concepts. The really interesting stuff will come in the second section of the course. So I have a few videos to show you. But again, what I will do is go over the concept very quickly because there are so many of them in the textbook that I would need probably at least double the amount of time that I have to interact with you to cover them satisfactorily. So again, when I ask you questions, what I want is typically the definition that is given in the textbook. Okay, so in the previous lectures, we covered topics like the division of labor and comparative advantage. And the key insight, as I formulated it before, is the notion that 100 people who specialize in what they do best and trade with each other will produce a lot more than 100 individuals who try to do everything on their own. Now, this holds true in every society. No society has ever developed without witnessing an ever more minute division of labor, and in parallel with that, with the emergence of cities where most of these divisions of labors are found. So you have rural regions that might be doing well at any given point in time based on the demand for either iron ore, wheat, wood, whatever might be. Do you mind sitting down and giving it to me at the end of class, please? And the thing is that over time, as people specialize, as was alluded to by the economist in the video that I showed earlier, your pay might go up even if your skill level does not increase. So for example, if you're a barber who still uses technologies that were around a few decades ago, it doesn't matter if your productivity increases all that much or not because of opportunity costs, because we need people to be barbers. As long as the productivity level of other economic actors increases, your pay will tend to increase as long as there is a demand for your labor. Okay, the third chapter is about innovation, the fact that new products and technologies emerge over time, that some regions benefit from this, other regions lose, and the result is inequality, both in terms of people who don't acquire new skills and regions who fail to develop new economic activities. So what the authors try to do in this chapter is to explain why innovation occurs in certain locations rather than others, and the consequences, both beneficial and negative, of coming up with new products and services or failing to do so and being supplanted by better alternative. Now, there are two ways to look at innovation. You can begin at the level of a creative individual, look at where ideas come from and how these ideas are translated through businesses or other means through the economy at large, or you can take a more top-down vision of the economy in which you try to identify big patterns of changes over time. Now, the authors are mostly enamored of the second perspective, so they discuss concepts like Fordism or waves of innovation over time. And truth be told, I'm more someone who studies innovation from the creative perspective. So one is more bottom up, the other is more top down. But because the author have their own approach, I'll try to stay faithful to it, even though I'll probably have a few critical comments along the way. So again, no need to write this down, there's just too much stuff. If you have specific questions about a concept, what I will expect you to do is come up with the textbook definition. Okay, so why do people innovate? Well, essentially because we want to solve problems or because we're unhappy with what we have. Now, you were all born essentially with smartphones around you, and the notion that you were once limited to a few landlines might seem strange to you. But there was obviously a need for better communication, and over time, through a number of new innovations that were combined together, we came up with a product that not only conveys voice transmission between individuals, but with various gadgets that allow you to essentially tap all of the human knowledge that has been codified. Now, obviously, this is an example of a major innovation, one that is ubiquitous today that you take for granted. But if you look at any industry in historical perspective, you find that over time, people tend to do better or more with less resources over time. So I don't know how many of you have been out shopping for a car, or if you don't want to buy a car, you'd rather rent, use Uber, or whatever. But even if you don't know much about car history, you know that a model produced this year, while it has the same basic design of another car model produced a century ago, is extremely different and a vast improvement over something that was at the time mostly made out of wood and had a very primitive engine, perhaps not even a rooftop, obviously no ways of receiving signal transmission from other devices, whose cruising speed limit was perhaps 45 or 50 kilometers an hour, and who tended to break down often, among many other things. So improvements in the car industry are very visible, but you can see improvements in every line of work where you have competitive markets. So again, today, if you drive around Toronto, you might see soft wheat fields or corn fields where everything is straight in line, everything is of the same height. But that was not the case a century ago. A cornfield would have been very different than today. A lot less corn would have been produced on the same piece of land. You would have seen a lot more weeds in the field because you did not have very good herbicides at the time. And so the result today is that we produce a lot more corn on the same piece of land, and the corn is of much better quality. But again, this is true for any competitive market. So why is it that people innovate? Well, obviously to remove feelings of uneasiness, to solve problems. There's never such a thing as a perfect product. There's always a way to do something better or less badly. But while everybody is motivated, perhaps, or has insights in terms of coming up with better products, the capacity to do something about it varies from one location to another. It might be that you're in the middle of a very sophisticated division of labor, so you can tap many different brains in one location, trying to improve a product or a process. But you might be the exact same person in a location where you're a subsistence farmer. I mean, you might have cell phones, because today's cell phones or smartphones are ubiquitous even in less advanced economies, but there's very little you can do in terms of developing an app or coming up with a better way of gathering or using information. So context does matter. One obvious context is the firm, or at least the network of people who are doing people's work. But also the regional context, the location in which you're based, will obviously affect your capacity to come up with better or less damageable stuff. So 3 broad tendencies identified by the authors. So path dependency. None of us works in a vacuum. We always build on what came before us. If you want to improve a smartphone or come up with a new app, well, you're obviously building on what already exists. You don't create something out of nothing. This is really how the human brain works. you build on what already exists. There's a foundation of knowledge or technology already out there, and you add to it. You typically never really come up with something out of the blue. Now, in market economies, you tend to have booms and busts. So economies might be doing well at a certain point in time, not so well at others. Unfortunately, we're more on the bust end of the cycle than in the boom one here. So 10 years ago, when I was teaching the same stuff, the economy was much better. I guess people your age were not too worried about finding a job, I suspect. You're a little bit more anxious than was the case among your colleagues a decade ago. And again, some regions, some cities are just much more innovative than others. Now, I've already covered this last week, but I want to revisit that again. So look at the idea of a bicycle, for example. In many ways, as I was telling you then, a bicycle is an extension of what people have been doing for a few thousand years, which was riding horses. The design is the same, the way you handle the thing is the same. A bicycle seat was even known as a saddle for a very long time. I don't know if you still use that word in the English language, but in French we use the French word saddle to describe a bicycle seat. Then some German engineer needed to test a small engine he had come up with, figured that a way to test it would be to put it on a bicycle, and without really thinking a lot about it, invented the motorcycle. So you keep adding stuff to what already exists, and you're trying to solve problems along the way. I've already told you that a few years ago, Denmark and California were very significant players, at least regional players in the wind turbine industry. The Danish built on their tradition of shipbuildings, especially propellers for boats, whereas wind turbine pioneers in California came from essentially the aerospace industry, but people who knew something about propellers. And they built on these two different types of knowledge to build wind turbine. And for some reason, a few years ago again, it was widely agreed that the Danes came up with better products. The extent to which this could be traced back to the fact that they came from a shipbuilding rather than airplane building tradition can be debated. But the fact is that they got into the business in the first place because they understood something about propellers. Now, what you have on the left is a regular tree, and what you have on the right is a tree of human creativity. So this is a figure that was drawn in the 1940s by a very famous anthropologist, Kroger. So what he argues is that natural evolution, at least the way it was understood back then, it's a bit more complex today, arises from new things emerging out of things that existed before, but you become something new when you can no longer mate with what you came from. This is how new species emerge. Cultural evolution, or at least the evolution of ideas, thoughts, and things and processes, he argued among human beings, is very different. Again, things are combined and recombined in new ways, and if you were to try to understand how the human mind works, how cultural evolution works, you would have to think of a tree where the branches are constantly merging with each other, resulting in the creation of new branches. So, while it is often convenient, if you do market research or regional analysis, to think of, the computer industry or the car industry or the mining industry, this is a framework that is useful to understand the economy to some extent, but if you want to understand how new ideas come along, how innovation is created in the corporate sector, really this is a way of thinking that obfuscates your understanding. Ideas are always borrowed from one field into another and applied to new types of problems, and new things emerge along the way. Now, the good side about this, about cultural evolution, is that in a way you can never really be worried about running out of ideas. Because again, if any new idea is the result of the combination of pre-existing ideas, well, the more ideas you have, the more likely you are to come up with new ideas. So if you believe that everything has been invented, as seems to be the case every generation, every few years you have people who write books saying, well, everything that could be invented has been invented. We might think you're at the margin, but we won't really come up with any new breakthroughs. This was proven wrong time and time again because of the nature of human creativity. So the more ideas, the more products, the more processes, the more potentialities for new ideas and new innovation. So I don't know what the future will be like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, but as long as economies go on developing, there'll be ever more stuff to create new ideas and new products. So again, I showed you that last time. We can see that going all the way back to the age of the cave people. So two tools here being brought together to create something new. Paper book, ideas from all parts of the world put together. A mine cart from the 18th century combined with a steam engine that was originally developed to pump water out of mines or put the two together. Mixed for a few decades, eventually you get the railroad. In the early 20th century, Henry Ford and his team have a nice problem. There's so much demand for their Model T that they can't supply the demand. So how do you go about producing more cars using as little resources as possible? Well, basically, as engineers go around, they begin to look in their environment, they visit other industries, and among other things, they notice that this assembly line of the meatpacking industry that I was telling you about. You see how you kill an animal, then you take it apart, and one of them has the idea, well, why don't we just reverse the process? So you borrow an idea from a field that would not seem to be too close to yours, meatpacking, car manufacturing, but you inverse the process. You add in ideas that people had borrowed from canning factories, flour milling, brewing, and eventually you get the assembly line. So again, you would have thought that ideas from the food industry would impact car manufacturing. Well, they did it in a big way. And again, this happens all the time. Okay, so then the authors engage into an attempt at classifying innovation. Again, if you look at it from the top, you try to come up with those categories. If you look at it from the bottom, from a more individualistic perspective, you realize that people can combine all sorts of ideas. Ideas about ways of manufacturing things, ideas about products, ideas about how to organize a corporate structure. But if you think of commercial innovation, you think of new products, new processes, new marketing methods, which are obviously important. Again, you were born in the age of social media, and the old ways of advertising products have basically disappeared today. But who would have thought, even 20 years ago, that advertising in a newspaper would be deemed obsolete? I certainly didn't see it coming. I mean, granted, I'm not that smart, but I don't think that smarter people saw it coming either. Innovations also vary in scale of impact, so you can come up with a minor adjustment, which will give you the opportunity to do something slightly less efficiently, but you can also come up with more disruptive ways of doing things. Now, this is often, in the perspective, the eye of the beholder. So if you go back, for example, to the car assembly example that I gave you, if you're in the car industry where people work on 50 different cars simultaneously and you deliver parts and you put cars one at a time, the idea of an assembly line is viewed as radical. But if you're in the meatpacking industry and you go to the car industry and they say, well, okay, they basically adopted our idea, is it really major in your eyes? Perhaps not. Perhaps you're just thinking, well, those car people finally caught up with what we've been doing for 50, 60 years. So what looks radical in the eyes of someone might be viewed as, if not marginal, at least incremental or a small step in the eye of somebody else. Which again is always the problem with these types of classifications, but the authors really distinguish between small steps and big steps. Or else the big step is often the results of a bunch of small steps. And so if you look at it along the way, you can see, well, a bunch of small steps eventually deliver something significant. But if you look at things from high enough, you can see, well, this is the way they used to do things. Now there's a completely different way of doing something. So obviously there was a major innovation. But in the process, you don't see all the small steps that resulted in this. So anyway, I don't want to bore you too much with this, but the point I want to make is that there are different ways of looking at innovation, and the authors selected a perspective, but I come from a slightly different tradition. Okay, now every product, as some of you may know, especially if you're commerce or management majors, go through a life cycle. So whatever smartphone was cool a few years ago was obviously obsolete today. But the life cycle of different products will obviously vary from one industry or another. It might be that you have a big piece of equipment to turn trees into papers. Even if the model that you bought, the machine that you bought 5 years ago might have improved a little bit, you're not going to scrap your equipment because you've invested so much into it. But again, if in terms of small items, the kind of things that you're likely to carry in your purse or in your pockets, the life cycle is obviously much shorter. So this is what your standard model of innovation diffusion looks like. So people come up with a new product. At first, only wealthy people or people who are really into technology or really have niche interests will tend to buy it. Then the product becomes popular. You can scale up production, reduce production cost. The thing really takes off. But at some point, something better comes along, so the sale of your product kind of stagnates and will eventually go down in the long run. Okay, so a number of people are invested in innovation. You've got people working in their garage, people working in large firms. University marketing people like to think that universities contribute a lot to knowledge creation. Universities contribute to knowledge, but they're rarely significant in terms of specific products and innovation. And that's because while many of my colleagues are very smart, they're kind of too removed from production facilities to be at the cutting edge of things. So you can develop fundamental knowledge in universities, you can train students who will then take their knowledge to businesses and help improve whatever it is that businesses are doing. But you often hear public officials saying that, well, universities should do more in terms of job creations. There's only so much, I believe, that what our fundamentally basic research and teaching institutions can do. Now, governments will sponsor various research activities, basic research labs, but again, there aren't that many innovations that came out of government research labs, and that's, again, because they tend to be too removed from the marketplace. What matters in the end, though, is that you have something of an innovation system, people who talk to each other, businesses who hire university graduates, a regional culture that favors entrepreneurship and risk-taking. All these things are ultimately what makes a region thrive. It's not, truth be told, entrepreneurs and businesses can do something on their own, but if they're in a region where you have a lot of resources accessible, because of that reason, they tend to do better. Okay, so techno-economic paradigms, this is the author's approach. It's kind of a bird's eye view of innovation. You try to rationalize what happened, and so they tend to differentiate the early mechanization. So the steam engine I was telling you about, the railroad, that appeared after that, then electricity came along. And so the argument is you have a few key innovations that come along that drag the economy for a while, then the economy slows down, then something radical like electricity comes along and drags the economy, takes it to the next step. In terms of communicating ideas, this approach is certainly defensible, but critics will argue that it omits too much. Okay, so again, this is how they describe their thing. I won't ask you to read this. This is a table 3.2. I won't quiz you on it, but that's again one bird's eye view of innovation over the last 2 centuries. Now, but what happens over time is that new products emerge, often from very different industries, and displace what was there before. So again, the car industry essentially put an end to the people who were breeding horses to do work or to move people around. So the people who manufactured cars were not the people who were breeding work horses. They came from a completely different line of work. The people who pioneer the knowledge that eventually turned into your smartphone did not come from the old-fashioned computer industry that existed before. So, I don't know if this is fair of me to say that, but both authors of the textbook are of a certain age, and they were trained at the time where large firms were viewed as being the be-all and end-all of businesses. You know, large multinational firms, large corporations had a lot of money. They could hire a bunch of scientists, pay them very good money, much more than small startups. And everything was rationalized with a few people who planned things, people who were working in plants making good money, at least for the time. And they sincerely believe, I think, that large businesses, for those obvious reasons, would tend to dominate the economy. So for a long time, things seemed more ordered. You would become a company man, not so many company women in those days, and have your career set, and you would go through various promotions within the business. A few people would reach the top. A lot of people would be middle managers or shop floor workers. You would have a union, and things seemed kind of regimented, and it was believed by many people to be the future of businesses. And then a few people were not so happy with the corporate model and came up with a few additional inventions. So again, I'm old enough to remember when the Apple II and the first Mac came along. So these are the first computers that I used, obviously. But the point of those people, Job and Wozniak, among others, at least they're the two better known, was that, yes, one of them was employed in a large firm, but he had his interests on the side in which his employers were not interested. But these people thought that there would be a niche market in which they could satisfy a demand that was deemed too insignificant by the large corporations of the time. And one of the main lessons that you can learn from this is that, yeah, it's nice to be big. People are often saying small is beautiful, but bigger is better. But in order to make it worth your while when you're a large firm, you need a large number of customers. You have no real interest in targeting niche markets that might look promising, but there's just not enough business volume to justify you investing in those various products. So this is why large firms often grow by buying small firms that have found this niche develop a market. And when the potential is obvious, then large firms will grow by buying smaller startups. So many of you have seen that before. You're all familiar with Bill Gates, right? Okay, so this is what he looked like when he was your age or something. So again, this was the Microsoft Corporation in 1978. It's easy to make fun of large corporations who missed the boat, but would you have invested in those people? And would you think that Microsoft would become the company that it became? Okay, so according to the author's view, what happened was that information and communication technologies came along and radically transformed the way business is done, the way work is organized, and it also opened many new possibilities in terms of innovation. And the result was that the geography of work really changed. So for a while it was believed that geography did not matter all that much anymore. But then new clusters began to emerge, places like Silicon Valley, and suddenly geography mattered again because an ecosystem of small firms it was quote unquote rediscovered, turned out to be more productive than a large rigid firm where people are much more compartmentalized in terms of what they do. The authors also discussed the emergence of a quote unquote new green paradigm. They don't go into much details. All I would say here is that I discussed those issues in more context in my energy policy course. Some things are promising, but there's also often a lot of wishful thinking in terms of green innovation. But I will skip over this because the treatment is short. And if you want to hear me talk more about that, I have my energy policy course. Okay. So, since this is an economic geography course, what happened again, as I was telling you, was that the importance of geography was rediscovered, and suddenly cities became cool again. People rediscovered the value of being located close to other smart people, and a number of countries tried to emulate the few examples, like Silicon Valley and near San Francisco, or for a while the suburbs of Boston were very popular, Route 128. And a number of governments tried to replicate these models, but these typically failed. It's one thing to observe a spontaneous process, it's quite another to try to create it from scratch. Okay. You can expect a question on codified knowledge and tacit knowledge. Essentially, the key point for geography is that it gives you the opportunity to interact face-to-face with other people a lot. Now, I know that a number of you were born and raised on Facebook, or at least you're used to communicate electronically a lot more than my generation was, but the point is that not everything can be put in writing. Either it's just too expensive, you cannot possibly put everything in writing, this would take just too much time, but throwing ideas at other people, getting your immediate feedback, looking at the similar problem from different angles, having a bunch of people with different expertise working on a project, can still be best done by having people in the same room looking at the same problem. And so this taps into their tacit knowledge. All sorts of things you've learned over the years that you know in the back of your head that you might not know is relevant, or things that have never been put in writing. Or else it might be the knowledge of whether or not an individual is trustworthy, and are you willing to share some trade secrets with someone, or at least best practices, knowing that that person is really collaborating with you and is not likely to backstab you in terms of taking your ideas or your insights to other people. So the authors then spend some time on local innovation systems. Again, they tend to repeat themselves here. They've already discussed these issues in previous paragraphs. But what is it that makes cities and agglomerations more productive? Again, a lot of face-to-face tacit learning, the fact that you can tap into people with different types of expertise, and the fact that you will run into problems that you don't anticipate. You might need a different type of know-how to solve that problem. Especially when you talk to people who have a training that is very different than yours. Even developing a common language is often tricky, so having people in the same room interacting with each other often matters a lot. It's still difficult to conduct creative meetings over Skype, among other things. Now the authors are from Vancouver, so they describe a local ecosystem in a pharmaceutical medical cluster that you find in Vancouver. So again, there's some applied research being conducted there. There's some university laboratories. We've got some preclinical trial, but a lot of that knowledge actually moves out of Vancouver, but there's still something of an ecosystem there. So regions are never autarkic in terms of knowledge creation, but still this is a nexus where a lot of people often interact and are in a unique opportunity to develop something new. But again, as I've been telling you since the beginning, the world is not fair. So some regions boom, others bust, others are poor and remain poor. And this has been like this since the beginning of humanity. It's kind of hard to believe that things will change. I mean, governments have tried for decades to spread the wealth across the country, yet places like Toronto keep growing, while places like Northern Ontario keep shrinking. And it's not for lack of trying on the parts of government, it's because there are basic economic forces that concentrate economic activities in a few locations. I don't know, maybe it used to be, you see that less on the CBC these days, and I don't know if any of you ever watch CBC News anymore. But when I was growing up, they would always, it was part of their mandate to tell people in Montreal and Toronto about life in Saskatchewan or Newfoundland or Nova Scotia or what have you. And the news from Atlantic Canada was always bad. It was always, well, the coal mine has closed, the factory has shut down, here is what the government is trying to do to entice business to move there. And they've been trying to do that for decades, and it didn't work. So even if you have a lot of resources, even if you transfer a lot of money, generating economic activity is a bit like creating life. Nobody really knows how to do it, other than hope that the next Bill Gates or Zuckerberg or whoever you idolize these days is born in a location and decides to actually operate from there. But of course, Zuckerberg was not from California. He moved there because there were other smart people. Gates went back to Seattle because that's where he was from. But he could have as easily moved to California and launched his business there. It probably would have been easier for him. Okay. So this is how the authors try to summarize what they call their innovation-led virtuous cumulative growth. So you've got creative people who launch their businesses, who begin to buy goods and services locally, who leads to the creation of new businesses, who might create collaborations with local universities, who will spawn a new generation of entrepreneurs, who will buy stuff from other people, which will then give them the opportunity to start their own business. And over time, the local multiplier effect creates an urban agglomeration. So as long as you have innovative people who come up with new ideas, you're kind of in business. But if history teaches you anything, it's that a lot of thriving cities, most of them actually eventually stall for a number of reasons. They don't encourage innovation as much as they once did, and they eventually decline. So, what the authors describe is the vicious cycle of underdevelopment. And so it's not only very hard to get out of poverty, but whatever you might have might at some point become obsolete. So for example, if you were in the business of manufacturing old-fashioned phones, and for some reason you had a factory in your country that specialized in making old-fashioned rotary dial phones, if you've never upgraded your capacity to do other things, well, you know, one thing, you know, the joke is that there are two things that are certain in life, you know, debt and taxes. But the debt of your manufacturing industry is also a given. You should always try to generate something new because nothing ever lasts forever. You can look at Alberta these days. You know, you put all your eggs in the petroleum basket. When the price of oil goes down, then you might have a problem. But then apparently Trump approved the Keystone Pipeline this morning, so I haven't seen the news. We'll see if people in Alberta feel slightly better about this. Okay. So this is how the authors describe the vicious accumulating poverty cycle. As communities go down, the smartest and most entrepreneurial people typically leave. The people who stay are people, how should I put this nicely, are less ambitious or are tied to a particular regions, are not willing to move. As jobs disappear, people become more depressed, social problems begin to arise, and it's kind of a downward spiral from there. So how do you break the cycle of underdevelopment? Well, government can spend a lot of money trying to convince large firms to remove branch plant operations to a place like Atlantic Canada. But when you attract business with subsidies, what history teaches us is that the business only stay there as long as the subsidies are around. If at some point the government no longer has any money to keep a business artificially in one location, the subsidies are gone, well, chances are the business will relocate elsewhere. You know, remember, if it's easy to move operations to a somewhat isolated region, it's very easy to sort of remove it from there and put it to another somewhat isolated or less developed location. Because if the only advantage you have are subsidies and low labor costs, well, these things are easily generated in other locations. Okay, so what the authors wanted to tell you in many more words is that innovation is the key dynamic within economic evolution. Innovation systems, which is what economic geographers are really interested in, you know, the world of innovation beyond the confines of a particular firm. So networks of firms, connections between firms and universities, large firms and small firms, develop at both the national and the local level. Obviously, some countries are much larger than others, so in a place like the United States, you don't really have a national system of innovation. But if you look at a country like Sweden, for example, which has less people than Ontario, you can see more of a national system there, but it's more really a regional system if it was in the United States. Successful institutional building results in virtuous cycles of recurrent innovation, so success feeds on success. If you're born in a location that values entrepreneurships, that doesn't penalize you if you fail. I mean, accepting failure is often very important for success. I mean, if some of you have the entrepreneurial bug, you're likely to fail a lot more than you are to succeed. But if you live in a society that admits, or at least does not put a stigma on failing in business, chances are that eventually good things will happen. If on the other end you're from a culture where failure is not easily accepted, if there's a stigma on it, then the idea that much in terms of new ideas and new products will emerge from such a context is dubious. Now, breaking cycles of underdevelopment, as they say, requires attention to technology transfer, but it's obviously more complex than that. So this is how they sort of summarize their innovation system lectures. I'm not going to go into the details here. I've already told you much about most of these components. The one thing I didn't discuss was the macroeconomic and regulatory context. Are you in a society that, for example, tolerates things like stem cell research, genetically modified organism or not? If you're not willing to tolerate a certain level of risk, what are the odds that you will eventually come up with something new? Again, these things need to be put in perspective. The only thought I would like to leave you with in that respect is that, again, there is no such thing as a perfect product, and I don't think that the standard that you need to meet in terms of innovation should be perfection, but rather creating lesser problems than those that existed before. So it might be that your new product, your new seed is not perfect, but does that mean it shouldn't be developed at all? Does it mean that people shouldn't try it, shouldn't try anything? Or should the criteria rather be that, yes, the thing is problematic, but it's less problematic than existed before? To me, that's progress, but a number of people disagree with that. Okay, any questions on this? Again, I apologize if this is kind of too much information in too little time, but that's the way the textbook is built. Okay. The next two chapters, it doesn't work, is about a business as an economic unit and labor. Now, the labor section is heavily influenced by the author's discussion of unions. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever belonged to a union? Okay. Another question, just so that I know who I'm dealing with. How many of you have ever worked for a franchise? You know, McDonald's, Meineke, whatever. Could you raise your hand quickly? Yeah, don't be shy. You see, I once taught at a school in the United States, Johns Hopkins, where his class size was about 3 times this one, and Hopkins is for rich kids. And I said, man, how many of you ever worked for a franchise? Nobody raised their hands. I asked them a second time, and I was like, okay, that's not my background. I don't know how to teach to rich kids, so at least I appreciate the fact that a number of you work for franchises and will know a lot about what I'll be telling you. Okay. Now again, you all know what a business is. Most of you, I assume, have part-time jobs in your life, perhaps even full-time jobs. So you already have a perspective from inside the firm. This is an economic geography class, so while you cannot avoid discussing the inner workings of the firm, the emphasis really is more in terms of business location and how a business interacts with its suppliers and other businesses. So what the authors do in the chapter is to look at the reasons why certain types of firms locate in certain locations and not others, how they're part of a bigger whole than themselves, how large firms especially locate between countries, how they invest in other jurisdictions, and they spend a few pages discussing again the greening of the value chain. Okay. So I assume all of you have been to Walmart, and you were probably born with the notion that Walmart has always been around. Again, I'm 47 years old, so middle age, but I remember a time when there were no Walmart in Canada. I remember when they came in, they bought Zellers and a few other stores, and a lot of people were afraid that, you know, the Americans were taking over. But the thing about Walmart is that it began as a small business. All large firms were once small. They were started, in the case of Walmart, in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas. Then they expanded in the southern United States. And one of the key to the success of Walmart was that they targeted areas which other large firms were not interested in, typically semi-rural or rural areas, believing that there was a market there that was underserved by other large retailers who were rather targeting urban environments. And so Walmart grew over time. He eventually moved to Canada in 1993, and their presence became ubiquitous. But the thing about Walmart is that you think that, you know, they're this huge juggernaut, were successful elsewhere, but they were not. They tried to operate in Germany, and they had a number of problems there. The same was true in other locations. But again, remember that all large firms began small. Walmart was not born big. It was born like a small retail store in the middle of nowhere, USA. But unlike most other small firms, it began growing and eventually became the retailer that you're all familiar with. Okay, but when we're talking about business, what are we talking about? In the context of the textbook, they assume that, or at least the implicit assumption is that when they talk about business, they talk about for-profit businesses. Now, you've got operations like Greenpeace, for example, which are huge. I mean, in many ways, Greenpeace is a large multinational, non-profit operation. So they have employees, they have headquarters, their direction, their top people are paid fairly decent salaries, but in the context of the textbook, they're not considered a business per se. They're a non-profit organization. Okay, so the short answer as to how the authors define business is to simply describe them as legal organizations that add value to goods and services to supply to consumers for a price. Nothing is free in life, and the only way you go from being small to being large in a market economy is by giving people what they want, by offering them a better deal than what the competition does. But they're not only in the business of buying and selling, even though that's their main business. As legal entities, they also have rights and obligations. So if you sign a contract with them saying that you will be paid that much for a certain period of time, if you fulfill your obligations and they don't pay you, well, they have obligations against you, and you could always sue a corporation. Publicly listed versus private businesses. So as a number of firms grow, they need obviously money to grow, and one way to get money is to borrow it from investors. Another is to offer stocks or shares. So you might make your initial public offering, you've grown your business, you want more money, well, you're willing to relent some of the control of your business in order to allow people to buy a share in your business, a process that will give you more money to grow your business further. But there are some large businesses that remain completely private, that is still owned by an individual or a family or a few investors. And the reason why they remain private typically is that they don't want other people to tell them how to run their business. And so they don't want meetings of stock owners telling them that they should go in one direction rather than another. And they might grow their business by reinvesting the profits that they earn, or they might borrow money from financial institutions, from pension funds, from all sorts of sources. But in the context of a private business, they don't have to answer to stock owners. Okay, then the authors become a bit theoretical, so they sound like the type of professors you might have heard before in management, but in essence they distinguish between different ways of looking at theories of the firm, and in the end they tell you that things are complex and that the reality is probably a combination of the theories that they've presented you. So they distinguish the neoclassical theory, which is the sort of view that you're taught in Econ 101, where everybody is in the business of maximizing profit, minimizing costs, where people always choose the best alternative, they always have perfect information. There's a behavioral theory that basically says, well, nobody knows everything, there's a bit of a gut feeling. If something is good enough, you're probably good to go for it in order to move on to other things. And then there's the institutional theory from which they come from, in which they put a lot of emphasis on people working for large firms, doing a lot of market research, analyzing reams of data, and making decisions that way. But it's not exactly the perfectly informed world of the neoclassical theory. So among other things, if I ask you to list the main characteristics of the neoclassical theory of the firm, I will expect you to come up with something like this, which is just a summary of what is in the textbook. So the main assumptions is that people are perfect economic agents, they're perfectly informed, they rationally execute, and they operate within perfectly competitive markets. The behavioral theory that I was telling you about, people are more viewed as satisficers, meaning they have limited information, they know that they cannot know everything, so they're boundedly rational, and they will typically choose the first alternative that is satisfactory and then move on to something else. The technostructure, well, you've got a lot of people very smart gathering a lot of data, and decisions are based that way. Okay, in terms of corporate strategies, there are different ways a business can grow. You can expand your business by doing more of what you do. You can expand your business by moving into other lines of work. You can increase the size of your operation by buying the people who supply you stuff, or you can increase your business by buying people who distribute your stuff. So these are forwards and backwards linkages, and the authors spend some time on that. So the biggest contrast, okay, some of you might know that I used to tell some bad jokes about the blind duck. I'm not doing that anymore. Cannot complain about this. Delicious food, good opening hours, all this stuff. Versus other types of businesses. What's the big difference between these two? Well, there are many, obviously. But the thing is that if you go to Red Lobster or to Burger King, it doesn't matter if you do it in Toronto, in Ottawa, in Syracuse, or Rochester, in upstate New York, in Los Angeles, or, well, I don't know if you've got Red Lobster in Mexico. There are Red Lobsters in Mexico. The point is that when you go to Red Lobster, you know exactly what you're going to get. You know that the specials are probably going to be the same from one retail operation to another, and you're part of an organization whose main goal is to cultivate that brand image and to make sure that wherever they are, customers get the same experience, because that's what they want. So typically when you drive along a highway over some distances and you need to stop and eat, at some point you have two options. Either you go to the local diner in the town where you have absolutely no idea what you're going to get, or else you typically stay closer to the highway where you know exactly what you're going to get. So there are pros and cons. Of course, we live in an age now where you can go on TripAdvisor and learn about local restaurants, and it's much easier than it used to be, so you're not as ignorant as you once were. But the point of certain types of business is that you know exactly what you're going to get, the experience will be the same, and this is what people want. And these businesses were successful because they gave a large enough number of people the type of experience that they wanted, and the experience is, I don't want to come out as too snobbish, but bland enough that it appeals to a broad range of people. Whereas more specialized local operations might cater to a smaller customer base, but also might be able to provide the type of ethnic experience that is not big enough to be franchisable. That's a word. In larger corporations. So, no blind duck jokes this year. So, corporate strategies. Well, obviously, if you're a business, what sets you apart? If you're any good, you will have something about your business that sets you apart from your competitors. So the video that I showed you at the beginning of class talked about comparative advantage. Some locations or some people are relatively better at doing some things than other people. And so in a market economy where you have a division of labor and exchange between people, it makes sense to specialize again in what you do best and trade with each other. Well, at the corporate level, the logic is obviously the same. If a business is not good at anything, well, chances are that it will be another one of those businesses that will soon join the graveyard of failed businesses. But if you have a competitive advantage, in that case something that you're relatively better at doing than other people, then this is obviously what you should be focusing on. It can be not necessarily your product, but the way you produce it, or the way you're able to tap into the creativity of your employees to come up with new ideas. But the point is that if you're going to be a successful business, you need to be good at something. So Walmart, for example, was not selling stuff that was not being sold at the time by its competitors. What they turned out to be really good at was logistics and managing their inventories. So they were selling essentially the same stuff that you could buy in other locations, but they were better at managing the stuff that they were handling, and they also pioneered the strategy of outsourcing a lot of stuff from China. And so logistics, buying more from China than their competitors at first, allowed them to grow. So again, it was not the experience that you got, shopping at Walmart was not so different than shopping at their competitors, but they became better able to handle the stuff that they were selling, and eventually they grew and they developed other aspects of the business experience that they offered. But they really had an advantage over their competitors in the way they operated things. I mean, the story is obviously more complex, but that's one competitive advantage they had over their competitors. Okay, so some basic concepts, and I apologize to the management students here, but I will ask you to understand things like internal growth as opposed to external growth. So internal growth will refer to things like investments in new buildings and equipment, new sites, expansion of existing sites, versus external growth, which means that you go out and you purchase things that are already operated by people, typically by people either operating in the same line of work as you do, or who are developing or doing stuff that you think would be a good complement to what it is that you're already doing. So unlike internal growth in that context, the local economic impacts are not obvious. So a firm might be based in Toronto, but if it buys a pharmaceutical startup in Vancouver, how does it impact the Toronto economy? Well, it might be that the headquarters will have a few more people to manage operations located elsewhere, but the impact will not be so enormous as if the businesses had decided to expand its Toronto operations. But typically a firm will only buy another firm if these firms do things better than they can do in-house. Horizontal integration versus vertical integration. So horizontal integration is when firm expands their existing product line to increase market share. So let's say that you're in the business of producing apple juice. Well, you increase your market share of the apple juice retail segment, for example. The vertical integration is when firms replace open and relational markets with administered markets to reduce transaction costs. So it might be that you're in the business of producing apple juice, but you decide at some point that you want to buy orchards, or for some reason a retailer or somebody who specializes in distributing apple juice. So this would be vertical integration as opposed to producing more apple juice. Segmentation. So in most market economies, the size of the distribution of firm and factories tend to follow a predictable pattern. You have a few large players, a few more medium players, and a bunch of smaller players typically. But obviously this depends in terms of the industry that you're looking at, and how easy it is to operate plants in remote locations and stuff like that. So I won't get into the details, but you've got large transnational corporations, you've got small and medium enterprises, and you've got an ecosystem in which you have a few large players, larger number of medium players, and large number of small firms. Okay, I'll go over this quickly. I've already discussed economies of scale, scope, and size. Large firms obviously have some advantages. They also have some disadvantages over other businesses. I assume that you're familiar with most of these, Samsung, Sears, 3M. These are brands that you've seen before. They're large corporations. But you also have large firms that are not so well known. So there might be people who produce typically industrial equipment that is bought by these large corporations, these final products you buy. And there are a number of those that are still held in private hands, and whose location is often still managed from where the founder was from. Okay, how many of you are familiar with Koch Industries? Political science major? Koch is the business that every Democrat loves to hate in the United States. So the founders are kind of right-wing, they believe in free markets, so they've sponsored a number of organizations that sort of promote the market ideal. So these are the two main brothers. Originally there was a father, then 4 kids, and then these 2 brothers, from what I understand, kicked out the other 2. They produce everything from animal feed. They have a huge network of pipeline to deliver natural gas and petroleum, but they're also involved into a number of products, consumer products that you might be somewhat familiar with, without realizing that this is the largest private business in the United States. So these guys are almost as rich as Bill Gates or the Apple people or the Walmart family, but you've never really heard of them, and that's because they control their business. It's not a business that has stock owners. And if you read what the founders have said, it will be over their dead bodies. They still want to have control in terms of what they do. The business will go the direction they want. And so far, they've done really well. So it's the largest privately owned business in the United States, which is involved in a wide range of industries. So I figured at this point you'd be tired of hearing me talking about big concepts, so I have a little 2-minute video to sort of break the monotony here. So let's hope this works.
One of our nation's largest private companies is proudly built on American values and skills. Koch Industries started in the heartland and has expanded to nearly every state. Today, that means more than 60,000 American jobs. We're still branching out into new fields, but our vision has stayed the same, to provide innovations that help people improve their lives. You may not always see our name on the products you use, but we're working every day to help make better food, clothing, shelter, transportation, hygiene supplies, technologies, and other necessities. Here, we build on each other's ideas to create more opportunities for people everywhere. Together, we are Koch. Find out more at kochcareers.com.
Okay, so the point of showing you that was simply to point out that you have a few large businesses that you're not familiar with that are very significant. But one reason you're not familiar with them is that, again, they're not owned by stock owners, and this is still a family business to some extent being run out of Wichita, Kansas, of all other places, of all places. Okay. You've got large multinational firms that you're familiar with. You've got large private businesses like Koch that most of you have never heard of, but still, I'm sure that they were involved in a number of things on this campus, everything from paper towel to perhaps BVCs or other types of things. And you've got a bunch of small firms that make up the rest of our economy. Now, the things about small firms is that most of them will not survive, and among those that survive, the vast majority of them will remain small. Things like Koch Industries or Walmart are the exceptions to the rule. Obviously, otherwise we would have a lot more large firms than we do at the moment. So a small firm is a small firm, but at the same time, it's not exactly the same thing. You can be a McDonald's franchisee, so you have your own business that operates a franchise that is part of a larger corporate structure. You might have a small firm that sells to local people. It might be a convenience store. It might be a restaurant, or you might be part of a supply chain. You might be making widgets of various kinds that you sell to other people up the value chain. Only a few small firms will ever make it big, or even large or medium to that extent. So the birth and death rates are high, and small and medium enterprises are obviously often family-run, very rarely unionized, and there are economies of scales that are limited. But if you're in a city like Toronto and you're on the manufacturing side of things, you might be able to develop a niche and serve many different industries. So while you're small and your economies of scale, which is ramping up your operations, are not big, if you serve many different customers in different industries, well, there might be economies of scope if you look at the Toronto economic ecosystem as a whole, as opposed to just the firm in isolation. Okay, so how does all this translate in terms of locations, and why is it that some locations are better than others at generating new startups? Well, the first thing you learn about economic geography, if you look at the history of why a particular city became a dominant player in a particular line of work, is typically because somebody who was born in that place and stayed in that place that had a good idea to manufacture carpets, develop new products, develop, I don't know, cosmetics, And over time, well, one firm became the training ground of other people who left that firm and created other firms who became the training ground for other people. And all these people saw an incentive to stay in one location because of the local ecosystem. So Toronto is not exactly known for one particular industry. I mean, obviously we've had car manufacturing and all sorts of businesses in this city for a while, but again, I don't want to pick up on that location too much, but if you cross the lake to Rochester, New York, the one thing that you will notice about the history of the city is that it became very good in optics, among other things because they had the German immigrants in the 19th century by the name of Bosch and Lomb who got into optics. So Bosch and Lomb is still around today. And eventually out of this ecosystem came a fellow named George Eastman of Eastman Kodak. Kodak was based in Rochester. And the reason why the city was as prosperous as Toronto a century ago and arguably more of a high-tech hub than Toronto was is because a few people happened to locate there. In most cases they were not even born there, but they happened to locate in this particular place. There was navigation on the Great Lakes. They came up with instruments that were useful to navigators. And for a while, at least for a few decades, the city was very prosperous, building on that local ecosystem. Now, new firm founders will often remortgage their home, borrow money from their relatives, and will want to be in a location where they know people. Leaving a city, moving to a location where you don't know anybody and starting a business from scratch is not a very attractive proposition for a lot of people. Now, it might be like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, that when Facebook takes off, you're based in Boston, but you realize that really the industry is in California. You move out there, your thing is already successful, you meet venture capitalists, you already have a lot of people in that line of work. That's kind of a different case. But if you have an idea that is somewhat original or perhaps even more generic that could be replicated in any number of large cities, then being where you know people, where you have your local support system often makes a difference. So the authors describe the sort of own place advantage. You know the area, you know the people. It often makes sense, if you can, to stay in the location where you're born if the location is reasonably prosperous and diversified. Now, Silicon Valley in the south of San Francisco was already a prosperous location before these fellows came along, but the roots, to a large extent, of the modern Silicon Valley can be traced back to what is called, to what people were known as the Treacherous Eight. So these are smart people who were recruited a few decades ago by a man who was impossible to work with, who had big ideas. But at some point, these people decided to leave. They founded a new business, which again incubated other businesses and generated other businesses locally. So these fair children, because the businesses they created was known as Fairchild, became the main incubator of the modern Silicon Valley, even though there were other businesses. And again, the story is more complex, but a few minutes on this. And this is a story that is well known.
It may be appropriate to speculate at this point.
But it's not unheard of. It's kind of typical of many other locations, which became very good at producing a particular product.
About the future of transistor electronics. Those who have worked intensively in the field share the author's feeling of great optimism regarding the ultimate potentialities. It is my hope to contribute to the fulfillment of the predictions through my new organization in California.
Shavi became an instant celebrity, and he was invited to labs all over the world. And then we'd come back, he'd report on his visitations to the labs and set us up on a new series of experiments. Okay, but we didn't finish the last ones.
I talked to Noyce about plans, also to Moore. Both said I was changing rules.
He changed his product direction away from a transistor to an obscure device, a 4-layer diode.
He was yanking you around all the time.
All these people had come out to build transistors with the
inventor, the godfather of the transistor, and now they're not supposed to be working on transistors?
We got yanked back and forth between these two competing things that he thought he could do at the same time.
This is the way I am. This is one of my scientific assets. Vacillation must reestablish authority.
Anybody who ever dealt with William Shockley came away thinking that he was the smartest human being they'd ever met. They also came away thinking he was a monster.
We were all thinking of leaving individual and going our own ways, and we wanted to figure some way we could stay together as a group.
It's all about the people. Shockley put together, this team of guys that became, as he put it, the traitorous eight.
We wanted to see hard rock, who could be looked on as a first venture capitalist. Matter of fact, he coined the word.
We had a list of, I guess it was about 35 companies to invest in them. All of them liked the idea. None of them bid.
The 8 of us got together and said, what should we do now?
We'd all have to go out and look for jobs.
Someone accidentally at the last minute said, why don't you go see Sherman Fairchild? Well, I heard of the name, because you see his picture in the paper all the time. He used to be a playboy hanging around El Morocco in New York with his buddy Howie Hughes. They had all the fancy showgirls tied up in New York. He liked inventors, he liked young people, and he decided that Fairchild Cameron Instrument would do the deal we were suggesting.
In order to seal the deal, evidently some value had to be exchanged.
Someone brought a fistful of brand new, spanking new dollar bills. We just signed one after the other, and each one took one and stuck to the way, and that was the Silicon Valley Declaration of Independence.
Okay, so if you care about regional development, this is the sort of most legendary story you can come up with. But again, if you look at the story of, how many of you have ever been to Akron, Ohio? Okay, what are they famous for? Tires? Okay, well, a century ago, Akron was one of the hotbed of the new synthetic rubber industry in the United States. And you look at the development of the city of Akron, fairly similar to that. You've got a pioneer who developed synthetic rubber. I mean, rubber is made out of stuff that came out of trees. And then people realized, well, you can make rubber out of petroleum. So people began to pioneer the chemistry there. Some businesses were launched. You had people learning the trade, starting their own businesses. And so these kinds of stories are typical. So the point here is that, yes, you learn stuff at a university, but the way I view my job, I teach you the fundamentals. I sort of help you understand, have a vague sense that progress is generally good, that some locations are better than others. But the real valuable skill you will learn will be on the job, and especially if you're in a growing sector in a somewhat small firm, but that is expanding rapidly. Well, you will see opportunities and you'll meet people that will really be able to help you launch a new business. And any successful location historically in North America and Western Europe has a similar story. So you've got creative people, they're successful, their small business grows, they train people who then go on, create their own businesses, and eventually a local system, a local ecosystem, economic ecosystem emerges, and there are various levels of connections. And as long as a new generation of entrepreneurs and inventors emerges, a city can prosper and reach in times the size of a Tokyo, a New York, a Hong Kong. So again, this is Fairchild, the business that these people created, and out of these came a range of businesses. And if you were to extend the sort of evolutionary tree of this business, of these businesses, you would see that a lot of them led to the creation of what is now Silicon Valley. But at the same time, once a location has become a magnet for a particular type of business, well, they will attract other people to that particular locations. So large firms, for example, based in Japan, will open a research and development facility in that location to keep track of what is going on. And you will have people like Mark Zuckerberg who will move from Boston, because if you want to be in that particular line of work, well, being surrounded by smart, knowledgeable people in that line of work is valuable enough to relocate your business. The same was true again a century ago for Detroit when it emerged as the main car manufacturing center in the United States. Before the emergence of Detroit, you had more car manufacturing firms in places like Boston, New York, and perhaps even Buffalo. But once the modern car industry emerged, a number of people relocated to Detroit to be part of the industry. Okay, but not all investment is the same. A number of large firms, once they're established, are not so creative anymore, but what they've become good at is standardizing production processes. And once they've done that, well, it might be that being located in a place like Silicon Valley is just too expensive. The real estate is high. For certain aspects of your business, you don't need necessarily the smartest people in that line of work. It might be that you want to put things together, so you manufacture various components in different locations. You might be looking for a location to assemble all these things together. And so in that context, moving to places like Vietnam or China might make more sense. Now, when this occurs, when a firm located in another country invests in these types of operations in another jurisdiction, this is typically known as foreign direct investment. And there are typically two ways in which a firm can do that. They can create something from scratch, and in that context, they will look for specific factors. Let's say a good port, access to the ocean, cheap labor, people who are willing to work long hours, who are disciplined. Or else you can buy a local firm and expand it and turn it into something that supplies your own value chain. Now, the author discusses spatial entry barriers in that context. So how do you scout the best location? Typically, these people, politicians in those locations will all tell you that their location is the best, but sometimes you have funny things happening. I'm from Montreal originally. I don't know how much you know about Montreal, but let's just say there's the city of Montreal, like there is the city of Toronto, there's the city of Laval, which is a bit like the Mississauga of Montreal. And I was told the stories that, you go to those fair trade you go to these places where important people meet, and then you would have representative from the city of Montreal who would tell, a large firm, oh, come to Montreal, it's so wonderful, and this and that. And then the Laval or the Mississauga people would come along, oh, don't go to Montreal, taxes are high, the city is full of potholes, it's really a crappy location. You really want to be in Laval. And so it's not just, one region against another, it's often within a particular regions, people saying bad things about each other. So how do you react as someone who has money to invest in a branch plant where people in a particular location tell you all the dirt about their neighbors? Anyway, so in Montreal they created this big local agency which is supposed to take care of problems such as this, but I don't know how it turned out. Okay. Now, historically, what happened is that obviously the people who would invest in other countries were people who had money and knew how to manufacture things. So typically, foreign investment originated from advanced economies. But what many people don't realize is that they tend to think that, well, firms from large countries will invest in poor places for cheap labor. But historically, that wasn't the case. Most foreign direct investment was actually between rich countries. It might be that if you were an American firm with some basic knowledge of chemistry, let's say synthetic rubbers, you would want to invest in a country like Germany that already had a lot of knowledge about that particular line of work. Or else you wanted to invest in Europe because that's where your customers would be. And so historically, while there was investment from advanced to less advanced economies, the majority of foreign direct investment was always between rich countries, either to tap into special knowledge or to be close to customers. The one exception historically was either industries where labor costs mattered a lot, things like textile, let's say, or else natural resources. A copper deposit could be in a place like Chile, and whereas you might, there wasn't any copper left in France or Western Europe, or at least not anything that was accessible and economically profitable. So the authors tell you that historically foreign direct investment was sourced mainly in a few rich Western countries and Japan, but it flowed to the same rich countries, most of it. The main historical exception was resource exploitation, and to a lesser extent, things like textile. But what happened over time is that some poor economies became wealthier. South Korea and Taiwan, among others, and large firms from those countries, like Samsung, for example, began investing in other rich countries to a large extent, and to less advanced economies for specific operations. Okay, so inward and outward, you've got some numbers here, the US, Canada, the UK, and developing countries, and you can see that the numbers are much smaller. Okay, we've already talked about value chains a few times, and yes, there's a lot of repetition between those chapters, perhaps a bit too much. Value chains, again, involve a number of firms that have different types of relation with each other, but they're all part of this whole that is bigger than the sum of its parts. So upstream integration is a question that is something that you can expect a question on to make sure that you understand the concept when we discuss specific cases. Upstream integration will refer to how core firms organize their suppliers. So we've already discussed the hierarchical model and the lateral model. So in order to make this a bit more comprehensive, you can look at the figure here. So you have a large firm that, for example, might be a car manufacturer. It might be that they buy their engine from some other supplier, but the firm that supplies the engine to that car manufacturer will buy various components of the engine from other suppliers, which it may own or partly own. And so the hierarchy model is one in which large firms deal with large suppliers who themselves have many suppliers, some of whom might have various suppliers. The lateral model is one in which firms are invested more directly in among subcontractors, and those subcontractors are less involved in the same business of subcontracting along the way. And what you have here would be the level of exclusivity. So some firms only have one customer. I guess I don't need to tell you that. If you're ever an entrepreneur, that's the worst thing that can happen to you. You really want to have more than one customer. Downstream integration. It's really how firms organize their distribution system. So upstream, whatever is supplied to your operation. Downstream, when you want to get the stuff to market. How firms organize their distribution systems in terms of logistics, warehousing, retailing, or recycling, etc. And again, you can have a cluster of operations in that respect. Okay, so what about, in that context, local communities, cities? Well, cities are obviously made up of economic actors that are strictly local. Let's say you're a tax accountant that only serves local customers, doctors, barbers. So your typical generalist doctor, for example, will serve a completely local base. It might be that a highly sought after, hyper-specialized doctor at U of T might have customers from other locations, but by and large, most medical professionals serve the local market. But other businesses are essentially global. They might be located in Toronto, but most of their customers might be elsewhere. And for a number of historical reasons, they were created here, but really their market took off when they began supplying people in other locations. Greening of the value chain. That's kind of the simple story that is often told today. I mean, that's part of my research, and I believe it is overly simplistic, but they wrote the textbook, I didn't. So basically, the way the story goes is that firms historically cared only about creating value. Yes, some areas were polluted, and some people were unhappy with that, but most people in most locations were actually willing to put up with some level of pollution if the alternative was not having a job. And so, for example, in North America today, we look at the level of pollution in China, and we find that appallingly bad by Toronto standards. But you talk to most Chinese people, and the surveys that I've seen are that, well, people would rather have some pollution than a job than no pollution and no job. So there was historically a trade-off in that respect. But by the 1960s, places like the United States and Canada had become wealthy enough that people began to care about pollution. And so at first, what people emphasized were specific technologies to deal with specific pollution problems. So for those of you who have watched the video that deals with that issue, you have a particular type of technology that might be mandated in a particular manufacturing setting. If you install that piece of technology and if you actually use it, then you're covered as far as environmental regulation is concerned. Then by the 1980s, according to that view, people realized that you could be more creative, that a problem can be an opportunity, and that turning waste into wealth might be something else. So people began to develop strategies in which you either don't create the pollutant in the first place or you try to be a bit more creative. And by the 2000s, it is argued, sustainability became a marketing selling point. Up to that point in time, businesses were trying to avoid getting sued or displeasing too many people, but then the story goes, being greener than your competitors became a branding or marketing asset. So again, I don't want to spend too much of my time complaining about the textbook, but this is kind of overtly simplistic, but this is the story that is told by many people who don't really work on those issues. Okay, local development perspective. Okay, what happened there? You see, this is how I usually get my information from the textbook, and I try to make them nicer. Truncated firm. I assume most of you have driven along the Lake to Hamilton at some point. You noticed the Ford operation along the way in Oakville. A lot of Ontario's economy was built around branch plants. So there were historically people who manufactured truck in Oshawa, which is why General Motors located there. You had other operations in Windsor and in Toronto, which is why American manufacturers opened branch plants here. You were also close to the Midwest, where the American car industry was. That was another location. But the problem historically with Canada, it is argued, and many locations in Canada, is that the country was, to a large extent, a branch plant economy. So you would have something of a tariff wall that would prevent Americans from selling directly, but it gave them an incentive to open branch plants like GM Canada, for example, and manufacture cars in Canada for the Canadian market at first. But the problem with branch plants, as opposed to locally grown entrepreneurs, is that the branch plant will never do more than what the corporate headquarters will allow it to do. And so many regions in Canada prospered by welcoming branch plants, but then they kind of stalled. And at one point, the branch plant closed, and there wasn't much left. And in many, this is especially true in many resource regions in this country. Northern Ontario and many parts of Quebec, for example, a number of foreign firms operated pulp and paper operations. And typically what would happen, well, you would have a foreign company moving in, creating a branch plant, paying the local people very well, and basically discouraging all entrepreneurship in an area, because starting a business is difficult. Recruiting employees is especially difficult when you've got a big branch plant in town that pays people a lot of money. And so a lot of towns that prospered around the branch plant never saw any real entrepreneurial vitality, because the high wages of the local branch plant discouraged that to a significant extent. And while the going was good, the region was prosperous. But if, for example, like in the Saguenay part of the Saguenay region of Quebec, you had a number of aluminum plants moving in for the cheap electricity, things were good, but then new products came along that displaced aluminum for some markets, other locations had cheap electricity. And so the region, the Saguenay region, has been declining for a number of decades in Quebec because the aluminum plants were just paying too well. So nobody else had an incentive to start a business. You might have had creative people, but then you could not offer the same type of wages that the aluminum plants were offering at the time. So branch plants are good for a certain period of time, and they're certainly better than nothing. But the history of branch plant development is one of prosperity for a while. This is good as far as it goes. But eventually these things will shut down and nothing else really will have emerged in the region, which is why a number of resource regions are becoming ever more depressed over time. Okay, so that's another way to look at this. I won't bug you too much with that. Business and the special division of labor, while local economies dominated by branch plants operations are themselves truncated. So again, as long as there's demand for a particular product, they're doing good. But if the firm folds or if too much competition emerges from other locations, then they're in trouble. Okay, the conclusion, and you'll be free to go. Businesses are the key institution organized in capitalist economies. All businesses integrate themselves within inter-firm relationship defined value chains. As institutions, businesses vary greatly, but business segmentation has important implication for location behavior and the spatial division of labor. But we'll talk again about labor and especially unions next week. Okay, if you were late, please bring me your proposal now. I'm sorry, but you'll be penalized with 1.95. And if you have some friends who did not